So Briahna Joy Gray had a conversation recently with two gentlemen that are working on Marianne Williamson's campaign. And I don't want to focus too much on the whole Marianne Williamson thing, but there's a particular question here in reference to strategy that I think is an important question. What is the strategy? And one of the things that Bree does bring up in this discussion as well, she brings up the question of whether or not they're trying to find a way to even appeal to those who are turned off by this process. So let's go ahead and get into this really quick. If you have not had a chance to do so, go ahead and hit that like button, guys. Thank you. And we will do call in tonight. We're going to talk about that whole IRS issue because that is suspect to me. But let's go ahead and get into this discussion because the title is, Can Marianne Williamson Win? I am familiar with Carlos, by the way. Carlos, he ran for office as well. He's in New Hampshire. But listen to this, guys.
What is the solution in a place? I mean, because you've described a lot of particular obstacles in South Carolina. And I was thinking about, I forget the exact number, but it was something like 40, 50, 60% of Black voters in South Carolina said that the Clyburn endorsement was dispositive for them in voting for Joe Biden. Joe Biden has incredibly strong numbers for voters, Black voters over 60, older voters generally speaking. There's something like 76% of all Black voters over 60 voted for Joe Biden. You've described the kind of time investments that are required to make a dent in the relationship structures that exist in South Carolina. So, what is the plan to break through? Is Marianne planning to spend more time in the state? I guess it should have been started yesterday or a year ago, maybe even, but starting now at the very least. What do you see as the path to victory there?
So the question is, long story short, what is Marianne going to do differently that will convince voters in South Carolina to vote for her instead of Joe Biden? And having lived in South Carolina, I got to tell you, Jim Clyburn has a strong hold on the state. He has a lot of support, especially among Black voters in South Carolina. It was something I didn't understand when I first moved there. Like, people seem to have like this God complex about Jim Clyburn. I never understood it. I never got it. But it's kind of like whatever he says goes. And if he says you need to support Joe Biden, for the most part, that's what people are going to do there. So it is very tough in a state like South Carolina to break through if you do not have that support and backing of Jim Clyburn.
What do I see as the path to victory here is like having Marianne come, having people hear Marianne and actually listen, like Carlos was saying. When people are giving her a chance and like hearing her and seeing her and interacting with her, they're coming on board. And so you got to do that. It's kind of tedious work, but it works. It's old school politics. It's retail politics. You still got to do that down here in South Carolina. It's just a different group of people you're doing it with. So as long as you're doing that, putting that time in, talking to the people, hearing their voices, seeing how your Marianne's campaign can solve so many of our issues here if she were elected president, and having that conversation with these people, you build that trust. You get that same benefit that people don't have beforehand, because they're always so worried about Clyburn's machine that they're not putting into work to actually fight against the machine.
You think?
So here's the problem. I got to say something here. Bernie Sanders did all of that. Bernie Sanders did that when he was in South Carolina. He spoke to the people. Now, if you listen to Nick, my comrade from RBN, Nick canvassed in South Carolina for Bernie Sanders, and they were flipping voters, not just in the cities in South Carolina, but also in the rural areas, which I feel like a lot of times it's forgotten about when people are running these campaigns. But they were able to flip voters. The problem is the moment when Jim Clyburn said, we're going to elect Joe Biden, that changed the game. So to Bree's point, how are they going to beat that Jim Clyburn machine? All Jim Clyburn has to do is say support Joe Biden. And for the most part, that is what most Black voters in South Carolina are going to support. You have to understand that South Carolina has one of the oldest electorates. It's not like my state here in Massachusetts. You know, it's not like a New York. It's very different. So most of the people who are actually voting are older. And yes, more younger people are getting involved. But when it comes time to vote, most of the time in South Carolina, they don't show up the way that they did here in Massachusetts.
You think Bernie didn't? I don't mean this. You know, I want to know honestly what your perspective is. I'm happy to criticize Sanders. You think that there was basically a sense of this is a fait accompli. I'm not going to make any headway here, so I'm just not going to make investments in the state.
I think what happened here during that time was it wasn't enough investment into that face-to-face field time. It's not that we did the wrong strategy. We just didn't do it enough because you need more. It's not, like I said, we move slower here. So it takes a little bit more time for people to adjust. And a lot of people were doing the fast in and out, and it's a little bit slower.
I take that point, Mercurius, but I guess what I'm thinking is without any other kind of amplification, without the amplification of someone who's popular in the state who can offer their endorsement and kind of do that work for you by proxy, without having the media on your side that could amplify your message. I mean, obviously, Marianne can't meet however many million people live in South Carolina. So I guess I agree with you. And Carlos, you said this as well. My experience is that when people meet Marianne first face to face or see her in a speech or something, they radically will change their mind about how they feel about her. I saw she posted a video, in an interview that she did with the Griot yesterday or the day before. And not very many people have watched it, but all of the comments are uniformly positive. The Griot, of course, is a Black news site. And I see that over and over and over again. So I don't doubt that in the least. But my concern is, especially given the hesitancy of the DNC to allow there to be a debate, what are the opportunities for Marianne to get in front of enough people to actually make a meaningful electoral difference? And I want to welcome you back into this as well, Carlos.
So I will add a little bit to that. So before Carlos speaks, so getting to know people, getting to know community leaders gives you that trust that a local community leader might be able to move their 30 people better than Clyburn can, because they have that. They're not in Clyburn's district. You don't see them. They're way out in some rural county like Lancaster, where Clyburn's influence isn't as much. But your local leaders are there. So when you're coming in and talking and you're meeting with those people, they give you that trust. They give you that network that kind of spreads out and snowflakes out that you can get to win here in South Carolina. It's maybe not different, but it's just people aren't trying to make those investments to meet with community leaders who know their community closer than electeds do, because
well, I understand that piece where he's saying you have to meet with the community leaders, but I'm just going to tell you again, having lived in South Carolina, my parents retired in South Carolina. I'm just going to go ahead and let you know, if she does not have that support of someone like Jim Clyburn, she is going to struggle in the state of South Carolina. What people have to understand is that, yes, you can meet with people as much as possible. Yes, maybe more of that needs to happen. Maybe more of that should have happened with Bernie Sanders' campaign when he went to South Carolina. But at the end of the day, if the person that a lot of voters, for whatever reason, still seem to trust Jim Clyburn, if Jim does not have their support, then the people who do vote are not going to trust a vote for Marianne Williamson, because they still look at someone like Jim Clyburn as someone who is a part of the community. He's from the community. He grew up there. They know him. And in a sense, some of them, and I've spoken to some of my friends there, some of them kind of look at Marianne Williamson in a sense that they looked at Bernie Sanders as here comes this white savior to try to help us all. Now, that is not to say that's what Bernie or Marianne Williamson were trying to do, but it leads to the fact that people are more willing to trust a voice that's from their community versus someone who's an outsider who's coming in, who's trying to just get votes. So if you don't have that support from Jim Clyburn, it is going to be really difficult for her. This is also why I said, and I still stand by this, I think it was actually a mistake for Bernie Sanders not to even try to get Jim Clyburn's endorsement. I think that was a big mistake, having lived there myself. So we're going to go forward just a little bit here. This piece right here.
DeSantis. And people, especially historically marginalized groups, well, not all of them, Black people, because as Carlos mentioned, Latinos are putting out feelers and trying other kinds of strategies. But, you know, Black people feel as though the most important thing is to defeat the Donald Trump-esque person. And if they don't believe that Marianne Williamson is electable against those people, if they believe that Joe Biden is a proven quantity, and polls suggest as much, that no matter how much you convince people of what their personal needs are and how much more likely Marianne is to meet them, that they're still not going to come out and vote for her. I mean, what do you do about that? And does that seem to you to be as big of an obstacle as it seems to me to be?
So I'm not going to say that's not an obstacle, but like part of what we've been trying to do here in South Carolina over these last few years is overcome that. Like, it's talking about it, because that is a essential dread that people do have. But you got to show them the way that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that there's more ways to beat Donald Trump than with just Joe Biden. And what we haven't been doing is talking about that, making democracy and the issues that we're running on prevalent to beating the Republicans. So what we do is we say, Joe Biden is the only person that can beat Donald Trump. What you might need to do for some instances and say, the only thing that's going to beat the Republicans is doing this U-turn on our economic system. The only thing that's going to beat the Republicans is bringing universal health care to all of our people to fix our needs. So you change how the conversation is going and make it about Marianne's campaign, about what Marianne is going to do, and about the things that bring people hope, that they want to see, the benefits to that. And you stop making it about a Joe Biden versus Trump thingy or Joe Biden this. You make it as Marianne is our way to beating the Republicans. It's the way to be. You have to have that conversation. You have to take that step of faith forward for people to begin to think it is possible.
But the problem is that people are naturally going to ask, why is she trying to primary a sitting Democratic president? People are going to ask that question. And if people ask that question, you have to be able to respond to that. You can't just say, let's just focus on Marianne beating the Republicans. People genuinely are going to have that concern. Like I said, my parents live in South Carolina. Some of their friends are just kind of like, what the hell is Marianne Williamson trying to do? You know, now I believe that everybody should be able to run. Like, I don't even think this should even be an issue, whether or not Joe Biden should be challenged or not. However, I would say, knowing how the DNC is, knowing how the system works, I wouldn't run through the Democratic Party. I wouldn't run through the Republican Party. I think if you really want to be an outsider and you want to come in and dismantle the system, I think you need to run as an independent, or you need to run as a Green Party candidate, something like that, third party or independent. We will not see the Democratic Party treat Marianne Williamson with the same type of respect that they're going to treat Joe Biden, even though the majority of voters right now said they don't want Joe Biden to run again. We're not going to see that happen. Just like we didn't see that happen with Bernie Sanders, right? Now people say, well, they'll do that too if you're a third party independent candidate. Okay, yeah. But the difference is, when you're running as an outsider, you expect them to treat you that way. When you're running in the same party and they treat you that way, you know the game is rigged. Like, you know they're working against you. That's a big part of the problem.
We are so focused on, I will say here, the negative stuff, because we've been beaten down. It's the only thing we see. But we have to start looking at the positive stuff to get that energy, to get that light, to get that purpose going, that we can have a better democracy. We can have a stronger democracy. And the crossover appeal to that for people that are, we also have an open primary here. So the crossover appeal for that for other groups changes the electorate of who is voting. It changes who can be a Democrat. It changes who wants to be a Democrat by bringing Marianne into that. And so when you start doing that stuff, you bring in the traditional Democratic voters. You bring in the people who just don't like Biden. You
Well,
bring in.
let me ask both of you about that then. Carlos, I'm going to come to you first. Are there efforts being made to attract independent and Republican voters? And do you see any appeal that the Marianne is having, any kind of demonstrated appeal among those groups?
That part is very important because let's remember Bernie Sanders didn't just have people who were Democrats that supported him. Bernie Sanders actually won the bulk of independents. When you compare him to Joe Biden, he had that support amongst the independents. Does Marianne have that support amongst the independents? Does she? Does she have any type of Republican support? And part of the problem is, like, if she is running on the same message, especially when we talk about foreign policy, if she's running on the same message as Joe Biden when it comes to foreign policy, yes, we're going to still give money to Ukraine. We're going to still give billions of dollars to Ukraine. Yes, we need to do a two-state solution in reference to Israel and Palestine. If she's running on the same, then some people are going to look at it and say, then what is this all for? That's part of the problem.
I have to say, I also want to address your first question about your listeners, viewers, maybe not being so excited about the Democratic Party. I can agree. I'm not excited about the DNC. I don't think anybody could be under the circumstances that we're living today. I'm excited about my party here in New Hampshire because we tend to do things much different than the DNC. And it's the obvious reason why they don't want us to go first. That is very crystal clear. So I'm not asking anybody to be excited about the DNC. What I'm asking them is to take control of their local parties. That's where the power is. That's where we're going to make change. That's how we're doing it here in New Hampshire. You know, I was able to win my election a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to be the first Latino on that rules committee ever in the state of New Hampshire. And
he could have left that out. Oh my God. He could have left that out. Taking over the Democratic Party in your state, I think the problem with that as well is we have a recent example to look at, and that's Nevada. We saw what happened. Didn't Democratic Socialists take over the Democratic Party in Nevada? And then what happened? What happened? They've been booted out. They just boot them out and said, no, this is not going to work. That's the thing. Like, some of the things that are being proposed, we have recent examples to point to show that that is not effective, to show that that's not working. And for Carlos to say, and I know who Carlos is, I've seen him run before, for Carlos to say, well, I'm going to be the first Latino to be on the, okay, but I don't really understand what that has to do with Marianne Williamson's campaign. You see the problem? Like, it just, I don't know. Like, I felt like that's a Democratic Party talking point. I'm going to be the first this, I'm going to be the first that, without explaining how you're actually going to help the people.
We're breaking barriers everywhere in New Hampshire. We just elected in a very red town a transgender man who's actually working for Marianne, who was an Elizabeth Warren supporter before. You know, I was a Bernie supporter before. We have somebody else from the Tulsi campaign. And this is an interesting point. We have people from all these camps that worked on all these different campaigns before joining Marianne. And Marianne has an ability to talk to Americans, not to talk specifically just to Black voters or to Hispanic voters or to Indigenous voters or to gay voters. She has an ability to speak to American voters. And that's something that she emphasizes a lot. And I think she's just different. She's able to attract those people. Also, Americans are tired of voting for the less of two evils. That is very crystal clear.
Look, guys, I appreciate all of this. And certainly.
Yeah, I hear all of this. That Americans are tired of voting for the lesser two evils, but Americans continue to do it because as long as you have that fear of we could get Donald Trump again, or we could get Ron DeSantis, who I actually think would be worse than Donald Trump, in my opinion, as long as there is that fear that's coming from mainstream media, which does drive the narrative, people continue to vote blue no matter who. They continue to support, they'll continue to vote for Joe Biden because they're afraid of getting Donald Trump, because they're afraid of getting a Ron DeSantis. So when he says Americans are tired of doing that, are they tired enough to break the cycle though? Are they tired enough to stop voting for the duopoly altogether and supporting third party and independent candidates? Are they tired enough to do that though?
You know, I guess I'm pushing back because I think that people don't want to, at least in this context, people listen to this episode, they are more familiar with Marianne than the average voter. They don't need to be convinced of what she stands for. Some people disagree with some of what she stands for. They disagree with some of her foreign policy takes. They agree with other parts of her or her domestic agenda or whatever it is. But the concerns are not about that. Ultimately, people, except for some people who I think the foreign policy stuff is a deal breaker, put them to the side. That's their choice. Other people are like, why should I invest in this again? Why should I give my donation to this again when the system is so rigged, unless I'm being given like demonstrable changes in strategy that are likely to have a different, to create a different outcome. So that's what I ask you, you know,
I'm one of those people.
Are there,
we're not going to
what's going on? You know, are there efforts being made? You know, is appealing to independent and Republican voters really a part of this strategy that's going to help in these open primary states? And if so, what does that look like? What is the infrastructure that's being put into effect on the ground in South Carolina that enables Marianne's time spent in the state to be most effective? Are there going to be efforts to try to meet with people like Jim Clyburn, who Bernie Sanders kind of famously said, I don't want to shake hands and wish happy birthday. Maybe that hurt him in certain parts of the country. Does Marianne have a different approach? When you say about New Hampshire, Carlos, that they do things differently there and they're not quite so beholden to the kind of these national politics, and you've said the same thing, Mercurius. What specifically does that mean? Help the listeners understand what opportunities you see, because I think that's on some level going to be much more persuasive to them than this idea that Marianne appeals to a lot of people. Like, we got that. Like, people know that. People here are familiar with Marianne.
I don't mean to be boring.
No, it's not. It's not about you being boring. I just want you to make the best case to this kind of different audience than a normal audience, the more generalized audience that you are usually talking to.
The strategy in New Hampshire is not much different than what we did for Bernie, because it worked.
That's a problem. So he said the strategy in New Hampshire is not much different for what we did with Bernie because it worked. That's a problem. And I'm going to explain to you why it's a problem. I look back on it and I think that Bernie Sanders' strategy for 2020, at that point in time, I thought that was a great strategy, whereas a lot of other candidates, they were focusing on these key primary states. Bernie Sanders traveled all across the country. Bernie Sanders came here to Boston, Massachusetts, and he really did not really need to come here. Like, just to be honest with you, like, some people are like, why would he go to a place like Massachusetts? It's not like he needs a boost there or whatever. But he traveled all across this country. I felt like that was a great strategy. And even he couldn't get there. Even he couldn't win. Because the DNC, the media, Obama, all of them came together to find ways to make sure that Bernie would not get the nomination. And that would have happened regardless if there was a Trump or if there was a DeSantis on the other side. That would have happened regardless, because they didn't want someone to get through that was going to say, yeah, everyone needs to have healthcare in this country. They didn't want that to happen. They didn't want that to happen. So if Bernie did all of that, traveled all across this country, at one point he raised the most money from individual working class people, and he could not get there. Why does Carlos think that using that same strategy that they use with Bernie Sanders with Marianne is going to help Marianne get there? And she's less popular than Bernie Sanders. Based on what I've seen so far from this discussion, it seems like to me they don't really have a different strategy. And if you don't have a different strategy, how are you going to be able to disrupt the system that is in place that is preventing anyone running on these progressive policies from getting in that seat in the White House. I think what they should be doing is looking back on what they did with the Bernie strategy and seeing what they could change. But just, oh, we're just going to use the same strategy we used for Bernie Sanders, and Bernie did not get there. Let's go on.
And progressive won. So there's no reason to change the wheel. New Hampshire is not looking for change. New Hampshire just wants the DNC to mind its business and let us conduct our primary. And I can only speak to what we're going to do here in New Hampshire. We have the infrastructure in place. We have phenomenal staff that are very experienced, that come from different progressive wings within the progressive wing in Democratic politics. We are attracting independent voters. There's even libertarian voters that like how Marianne speaks about government and just less government in general. And there are voters in New Hampshire.
That's interesting because I've interviewed libertarians, and particularly libertarians in New Hampshire, and they are definitely not for these progressive policies. They do not agree with Medicare for all. They're not for these progressive policies. So that's interesting that he's saying that.
New Hampshire is very independent. There's a lot of veterans in the state of New Hampshire who actually don't disagree with Marianne's foreign policy, especially when it comes to Ukraine. As a progressive and as a Democrat, I actually don't disagree with Marianne on Ukraine. I know that's a controversial subject on some progressive politics. Sorry, I cut out there for a second. But I have to say, in New Hampshire, none of those things are a deal breaker. I think the only obstacle we have here in New Hampshire, people are asking, they want somebody with experience.
But she doesn't have the experience either. So that's why I push back on this, because first of all, we have to remember New Hampshire is not representative of the rest of the country. So we have to remember that. That's my north neighbor, New Hampshire. It is very different from Massachusetts, and it is not representative of the rest of the country. It's a very different place. I will say that. But he says he wants someone that has experience, but she doesn't have that experience.
Have been doing a much better job at presenting New Hampshire voters to Marianne to make sure that they understand Marianne's background in community work, in churches, in with the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s. These are important facts that the media has been trying to hide or twist or misrepresent. And so we've been doing a much better job at just making sure that people, Granite Staters here, understand her background and all the experience that she brings to the table.
Well, that's a great example, Carlos. I'm glad you brought that up.
If you've been in DC for your whole entire career, that's not experience. And that's actually not what we need. Joe Biden, the only thing he has to bring to the table is the fact that he's been in Congress his whole entire life. Why do we want more of that?
I'm glad you brought up that particular example of we've gotten a little early taste of the strategy that is likely to be deployed against Marianne. The Women of the View last week, or maybe it was the week before, covered her campaign, and Sunny Hostin in particular accused Marianne of having been dismissive of the AIDS crisis, arguing that she didn't, thought that people could self-heal or something like that, in a way that I think pretty egregiously misrepresented her record of offering spiritual support to people who were dying from that crisis and being ignored by the government, generally speaking, as that crisis was ongoing. Strategically, The View is a huge platform. And given the barriers that we've discussed already to Marianne accessing other kinds of large platforms like a debate stage, what kind of discussions have there been about how to push back against that, especially since so much of left media also is not, frankly, very supportive of Marianne? Much of it is, obviously, but some of it isn't.
So here's the people who have said they're not supporting it so far, besides RBN. Sam Cedar doesn't support it. He said on stream he doesn't support it. I don't know about TYT. They seem a little like they didn't seem like they were really feeling it. Then you also have that group called the Left Mafia. They weren't feeling Marianne Williamson. And one of the things I noticed about this space, it seems like if TYT is not on board for the candidate, then it seems like a lot of the progressive voters are not on board with it either. And based on that interview I saw with TYT, with Marianne, Jink, and Anna, They didn't seem to be feeling Marianne like that. The fact that people even have to try as hard as they are to push Marianne on the left, and I'm not talking about people who are not a part of the progressive space. I'm talking about the fact that people have to try this hard to convince other progressives to support Marianne Williamson. That in itself lets you know that this is not the one. That in itself, nobody had to try this hard to push and to sell Bernie Sanders to other progressives. People got behind Bernie because of his message and because of his passion and because he spoke from within his soul. It felt like you believed Bernie Sanders. He traveled all across this country. It didn't seem like a vanity project at that point in time, but I didn't have to be convinced to support Bernie Sanders. The policies stood on its own, and I believe the passion behind his voice. Now, we can go back and say a lot of things about Bernie Sanders now. Obviously, those things did not transpire, and we see him for who he really is. But the point that I want to drive home is, again, the fact that they have to try this hard to convince other progressives to support Marianne Williamson and that Marianne is a viable candidate, that is the big red flag. If a lot of other progressives are not supporting Marianne Williamson running for president, that speaks volumes to me. It should not be this hard. That's the thing. It should not be this hard. And I'm going to show you in just a second, I'm going to show you a clip that is one of the reasons why I feel people are not taking it seriously. And part of it is because of who's pushing it. Because see, some people forget that Marianne ran for president in 2020. And some people have forgotten what some of those same people who are pushing Marianne Williamson right now, some people forgot what they were saying about her when she ran in 2020. And so we have to look at it kind of suspect as to why you all in for Marianne now, considering the things you said about her when she ran in 2020. Let's go on.
So strategically,
strategically, I think we've done a great job at making sure that these gay people that were directly affected during the AIDS crisis and HIV crisis, I wasn't born during that. I was born in '89, so it was that happened before my time. But what I can tell you is we're putting people in front of Marianne and we're bringing these people on board, these people that were maybe silent last time when she ran that are now coming up and speaking up. There's a beautiful video that we just put out of this person giving a testimony about his relationship with Marianne and him living through the AIDS crisis and the influence that Marianne had on him. And the fact that it is not true. Marianne never told any of these people, do not take your medication. So that's what we're doing. We're letting voters choose for themselves. You can hear it from The View, which is an entertainment source, and you can take it for whatever you want, or you can take it directly from the person that is being affected or was affected during those times. And that's really, this is the type, we know, Bernie used to say this, the revolution is not going to be televised. And we have learned some valuable lessons from 2020 that we know that the media is not going to give us, at least the CNN and MSNBC is not going to give us a fair shake. But that's fine. Voters in New Hampshire are not making political decisions based on CNN, MSNBC, or The View for that matter. They're making decisions based on their interaction with the politicians that are coming here and the people that they're listening to.
But the majority of Americans are making their decisions based that way. Let's just be realistic. The majority of Americans are basing it off of what they hear on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. That's just the reality. Like I said, New Hampshire is a different place. New Hampshire is a different type of place. Let's fast forward here, because I want to speed up to this part, the debate stage.
To debate Biden because we will make the case at the stage. And I think that's partly another reason why they don't want to debate Marianne. She's going to bring the receipts to the table and we have no problem. And we have so many people, even that political article that came out, which I thought was a low blow. Just basically, we have tons of staff speaking up saying they loved working with Marianne. They still love working with Marianne. I've had a couple of people call me and say the same thing. They're like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "I'm perfectly fine." She is like any other boss. She tells me what I need to do, but I also tell her, "Hey, this is what we need on the ground." We have a great time on the campaign trail. The energy's there. We're enjoying the campaign. And I have so many voters coming out. We had voters last time she was here during a snowstorm. There was a state warning that there was going to be this giant blizzard coming, and people still came out. We had people that didn't agree with Marianne show up. And still the level of civility and conversation that happened in that room is admirable. And it's what the American public is ready for.
Well,
so
let me ask you about
skepticism, but
let me ask you about that, guys. Since you brought it up, you know, for those who don't know, there was a political article last week titled "Marianne Williamson's Abusive," in quotation marks, "treatment of 2020 campaign staff revealed." In it interviewed 12 people, I'm reading from it now, who worked with Williamson during her 2020 presidential campaign, paint a picture of a boss who can be verbally and emotionally abusive. A staffer said, quote, "It would be foaming, spitting, uncontrollable rage." I mean, what is your guys' reaction to that story? Do you know anything about the sources and what's going on there?
Yeah, one of the sources that spoke up happens to be somebody from New Hampshire, and I don't want to really get too much into details. This is somebody that I actually admire and have a lot of respect for. And I'm not here to question victims. You know, I'm always about believing victims, whatever they say. But that said, just those comments alone, would we say that about somebody like Joe Biden? Would we say that about Barack Obama? We would never say that about a male figure. So, you know, those words that they use, as a man, I'm actually offended for women in this country that this is how.
Yeah, I totally understand that point that he's bringing there, that people are more likely to do that against like women than men. But the question that I have is, did it happen or not? I mean, is that true? This isn't the first time that this has been brought up. If you watch the interview, or not the interview, the segment recently with Due Dissidents, they actually talked about this, that apparently even back during when she was working with patients during the AIDS crisis, apparently there was an article that was released back then that also mentioned how some of these same things that are said to her, about her in that political article, there was an article released back then talking about her treatment of people and her behavior. So this is not a one-off. Go watch the video with Due Dissidents. I'll see if I can find it. Watch the video with Due Dissidents where they pull up the article from when she worked with patients during the AIDS crisis. It was the same sentiment as what you saw in that Politico article. Now, this is not to say that these articles like Politico are not going to come and smear people. They're going to. They did this to Bernie Sanders too. They said that he was like, it was like racist, sexist, like that kind of stuff. They did that to Bernie too. But if this happened more than once, then I see it as a pattern. So was it false both times or just this time? So the question is, like Carlos says, he knows one of the people that came forward in that article who actually lives in New Hampshire. So this is one of them is someone that Carlos knows. But my question is, again, did it happen or did it not?
How we speak of.
I mean, so Carlos, I definitely think that we have seen on video Joe Biden behave in ways that I would describe as foaming, spitting rage. Like we saw him jab his finger in the chest of that was some kind of like plant in the 2020 race and antagonizing this guy in a hard hat. We've seen him say "listen, fat," and challenge one of his critics to push-ups because he got so angry. We know that he's had a number of Me Too allegations made against him, et cetera, et cetera. But I would also say that some people are going to think, well, even if we wouldn't hold a man accountable for behaving badly, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't hold women accountable for behaving badly. So, I mean, what do you say to people who have some concerns about this?
I mean, I'm a younger generation where I don't see gender, I don't see color, I don't see sexual orientation. I treat everybody how they treat me, and I can only speak to my experience. I am not here to discredit any of the victims. I don't believe in doing that. I think that's when they go low, we go high. I can only speak to my experience.
Okay, let's get into, because I want to show you something here, because I have memories. I do have a good memory. Oh, where did that okay, that one's not up. Let me put that one up. we need to talk about something here. First and foremost, one of the things that was discussed was what is like the strategy. Carlos said the strategy is to use the same one they did for Bernie Sanders. I don't think that's a good idea because, like I said, Bernie traveled all across this country. He was one of the most popular candidate that was running, actually. And even Bernie couldn't get there, right? Because of the system that's in place. So the strategy needs work. The other thing that I've noticed is that people who are not taking it seriously, some people are like, this is not serious, this is yada, yada. There's a reason for that. There's a legitimate reason for that. And one of the reasons is the fact that some of the same people who are pushing Marianne Williamson now, they are using some of the same smears that The View used towards Marianne. Some of the things that people are saying about Marianne now, mainstream media, the crystal ball thing, the hippie kind of, that type of energy, mainstream media is using those smears against Marianne now. I just want to remind you that one of the people who's heavily pushing Marianne right now used those same smears against her when she ran in 2020. And this is one of the reasons why some people are not taking it seriously. Now, this is from 2020 election. This is Kyle Kulinski. The name of this video is Marianne Williamson deletes a very dumb tweet, then doubles down. The point of this is not about the tweet. The point of this is the way that he describes her in this video. Listen to this.
So Marianne Williamson tweeted and then deleted the following. The Bahamas, Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas may all be in our prayers now. Millions of us seeing Dorian turn away from land is not a wacky idea. It is a creative use of the power of the mind. 2 minutes of prayer, visualization, meditation for those in the way of the storm.
Now, does Marianne no longer believe in prayer and meditation? No, she still does, right? Okay. Listen to this.
Now, you could see why she deleted it, because that's the silliest thing I've ever heard in my life. I want to repeat part of it here. Millions of us seeing Dorian turn away from land is not a wacky idea. It is a creative use of the power of the mind. No, it's not. It's called hoping some shit happens that will have no discernible effect on reality, empirically. So now listen, don't get me wrong. If you want to do such a thing, am I against it? No, you can do whatever the hell you want to do. I don't care. You want to wish away the storm? By all means, go right ahead. The thing that is not okay is this idea that, like, it'll have any effect. Because we know it won't have any effect. We know that this nonsense, like, the power of the mind, yes, that's, absolute trash. That's, like, hippie, mystical thinking, energy.
Wait for it.
Crystals, chakras, nonsense.
Isn't that the same thing? The same thing that mainstream media is saying about Marianne Williamson right now? Do you guys see the problem? This is why some people don't take it seriously. Because let's be clear, Kyle Kulinski, who is a big, big, heavy pusher of Marianne Williamson's campaign right now, let's just call it what it is. He was one of the people who used the same type of rhetoric that mainstream media is using against her right now. He used that same rhetoric when she ran in 2020. That's why some people don't take this as a serious thing. So now all of a sudden, I'm supposed to believe that all of a sudden Kyle Kulinski 100% believes that Marianne Williamson is the one. After all those videos in 2020 where he called her crazy cuckoo lady, crystals lady, all that stuff. Now I'm supposed to believe that he did a complete 180 and believes that she can get to the spot that Bernie Sanders weren't supposed to get to. Make it make sense, people. Make it make sense. I don't buy it. I don't buy it at all. There is some type of other energy happening here with this. There really is. To me, it's just like replacing that Bernie mark, right? You have to have someone replace that Bernie campaign. Who can we insert in this spot to keep this going? And Do Dissidents was spot on about this. Now they'll be on next week. Let me fast forward, because the part that I want to show you that letter. And they were talking about, here it is, right about here. Listen to this.
Other people is she yells and she's mean and she's not the kindest to her own staffers, which again, she categorically denies. Now, by the way, there's all this anonymous. There's one person in the article that they actually like.
Okay, hang on. So here again, he is grossly misinforming his audience. Why is it anonymous, Kyle? Why is it anonymous? Well, we have a portion of that Politico article to explain why it's anonymous. We got into this a little bit with the NDAs. Williamson feared that her staff would go behind her back and talk to reporters about her behavior, according to 6 former staffers who said she required campaign employees to sign non-disclosure agreements and made clear that they would be strictly enforced.
Now, by the way, Kyle Kulinski never mentions that in that segment that they were just showing you. He doesn't bring this up. He also doesn't show the article, which is suspect. When do you see me, guys? When do you guys see me not show the articles? When do you see me not do that?
At one point in 2019, she suggested monitoring staffers' phones, according to one of them, but never followed through with the idea. Williamson denied that she ever suggested doing such a thing.
Now, let's fast forward to the part where he shows the other letter. This is the one.
Caused grumbling in the ranks. One staffer, the Manhattan Center's board director.
Okay, yeah, this is the one. This article is from 1992. So listen to this.
Contract and later settled. Quote, Marianne is someone who likes to control everyone around her, said journalist Gene Halberstam, formerly on the Manhattan Center's board. Let's look at the People exhibit. Is this just a random quote from the LA Times? Is this only one source? Her treatment of other loyal employees has also caused grumbling in the ranks.
Okay, this is from People magazine, March 9th of 1992.
One staffer, the Manhattan Center's board director, Regina Hoover, was put on probation with Williamson's consent last year, 1 week before Hoover's scheduled double mastectomy. A short time after her surgery, Hoover was fired, then forced to haggle for months over the terms of her medical insurance. Oh, yeah, she's a saint. Quote, Marianne's ego is all over the place, says a worker at the LA Center for Living who wishes to remain anonymous. When she's mad, it's like watching a 3-year-old throw a tantrum.
Now, people can change, right? People can change over the years. This does happen. But it points to a pattern. This is not the first time that she has been accused of having that type of behavior. So that tells me there's a pattern. That's going back to 1992. Something to think about. I'm gonna go to some of the comments. If I don't know what type of strategy they're really trying to do, but this whole strategy of following what you did with Bernie, I think is a bad idea. Because like I said, he was very popular and even he couldn't get there in the end. But if I was Marianne Williamson, I would be focusing on my strengths, the areas where I'm strong. And one of her top, policy pieces when she was running in 2020 was on reparations. And I've seen lots of interviews with Marianne, and I don't see that many people even bring that up. Like Nick and I, we brought that up when we interviewed her. If I were Marianne, I would be focusing on the key areas where I am very strong. And I would take the time to learn about the areas where I need to improve. But just going on to people's shows and just being like this middle of the road conversation that she had with Glenn Greenwald, it's like, you got to stand for something or you will fall for anything. What do you stand for? This is a question anyone should ask themselves if they are running for office. What do you stand for? If I close my eyes and you say, what's the first thing you think of when I mention Bernie Sanders? If we're back in 2020, things will be different now. Back during 2020, Sabrina, what's the first thing when you think of when I say Bernie Sanders? Boom, Medicare for all. Don't even have to think about it, right? Don't even have to think about it. What's the first thing that you think of when I say Marianne Williamson? Put it in the chat. What is she running on? What is her key policy position? This is very important. What do you think of? Tell me. If you have to stop for more than like 15 seconds to think of something, what does that tell you? James said, drawing a blank. Ozzy said Hamilton. Okay. Anthony, incense and peppermints, moon crystals. Like, do you see the problem, guys? Bryce says support for Ukraine and Israel. Lee says, I got nothing. Kenneth Orb. Kimberly, taxing corpse. Luz says idiocy. Black Zen says mansplaining. Giovanni says absolutely nothing. These are not good. You see the problem? Otherwise, people just gonna see you as no different than the other guy. You find the areas where you are strong. You focus on your strength. I learned this from a previous supervisor of mine a couple years ago. You focus on the key areas where you are strong, and you take the time to improve on the areas where you are weak. But when you go onto these interviews, you focus on your strengths. And I feel like a lot of these interviews that I've been seeing, I don't feel like that's happening. I don't. But that's just my opinion. Let me go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, Justin. Part of the problem, there are so many problems with her campaign. My prediction, no nomination and 0 votes in the general election. Such a bad idea. Thanks, Chris, for the super chat. I wish Bree would come out more forcefully about abandoning the party. Entertaining ideas of taking over the party seems to be backtracking to me. Well, I think Bree votes green in the general, right? I think she votes green in the general. Thank you for the super chat, Graham. Medicare for all voters should negotiate with Trump. Opinion. That's interesting. That's interesting, Graham. Thank you for this super chat, Justin. Dem party primaries are designed to prevent good candidates from getting on the ballot. A Green Party candidate is more likely to be elected than a progressive seeking the Dem Party nomination. That's why I'm like, if you're really going to go all in, man, you might as well just go complete outsider. Thank you for the super chat, The Traveler. Back in 2016, Clinton had complete control over the DNC's finances way before a vote was made. Who will control the DNC's finances in 2024? Because it seems like a conflict of interest. That's a good point. I'm actually going to see if I can bring Nico back on to talk about the DNC fraud lawsuit. Thanks for the super chat, Roger. Maybe try hiring the Marianne Stan from Calling. You're funny. Thank you, Kevin. Every generic Dem talking point right there. Thank you, Roger. He made fun of crystals until he got him one. You're funny. Thank you, Justin. You can't make it make sense, Sabby. These people are insane. Oh, man. I just hate to see people get their hopes all up again. I'll take the comments on Rockfin and Eric, and then I'll go to the next story. Thank you for the tip, JVB. Sabby equals brilliance. And thank you for the tip, Roger. Bree should have been screaming DNC fraud lawsuit, reveal DNC fraud lawsuit, reveal DNC fraud lawsuit, reveal. What will you do about that? All this means nothing if that's not addressed. Also, South Carolinian millennials and Zoomers need something to vote for. Sadly, they are not a CBI state for them to have something to come out. So we don't get a true reading on where they are issue by issue. That's a very good point. That is true. We don't.